So we're just going to show Kimiko's video first, and then we'll hear from Healey and then take questions.
Hello, my name is Kimiko Fraser. I'm the illustrator of Her Courage Rises by Healey. I'm so excited to share with you a little bit of my artistic process today, especially how the research and archival images inspired the illustrations of Her Courage Rises. Firstly, I wanted to say thank you to Megan Purcell and the Friends of BC Archives for giving Healey and I the opportunity to talk about our book. I'm so grateful to be a part of this project, and it's been a real pleasure to be able to collaborate with Healey, who's a wonderful writer, and to work with our publisher, Heritage House, who are an amazing team of really talented people. I'm an illustrator from Vancouver Island, and I have a Bachelor of Arts in History and Visual Arts from the University of Victoria. I'm very fortunate to have been able to pursue both of my childhood obsessions as post-secondary studies. I've been drawing and painting for as long as I can remember, and my interest in history started almost as soon as I could read. So that my interest in history rather naturally led to my paintings being inspired by artifacts and historical clothing and stories from the past. So when Laura, editorial director of Heritage House Publishing, approached me with the idea of illustrating Healey's new book, Her Courage Rises, I thought it was a great fit and a real dream come true. I work with a number of mediums to make my illustrations, but right now I mainly use watercolor, ink, tea, and digitally painting. Each has its benefits and its drawbacks, so it's nice to be able to have a diverse toolbox so I can select the right medium for the right project. For the illustrations in Her Courage Rises, I worked digitally, which I'll give you a demonstration of shortly. When I started working on the portraits, the manuscript wasn't finished, but I had a really helpful list from Healey of all of the women that were going to be included in the book. I felt that it was important for me to get to know the history of each of the women, so I did a bit of my own research. After my history degree, research felt like a really natural place to start. I hoped that reading about their lives would inspire the portrait in some way, and it often did. I wanted them to be exciting and interesting and inviting, not just an accurate portrayal of the person. I wanted the story to be able to be told in the image as well as in the text. And so I would often look for something in their life story that I could incorporate into it. So like a symbol or a pattern or a historical color that would relate their image back to their story. Because I'm a little bit obsessed with plants and Victorian florography, I often would look for the botanical in these stories. Like for Catherine Schubert's portrait, I included the rose hips around the frame of her portrait because she ate rose hips to survive on her trip. Another example is for Barbara Tucci's portrait. I included flowers on the border that her daughter mentioned that she particularly loved. And it was really nice because she sent me photos of the flower, so I knew exactly what to draw. And for Kimiko Murakami, I included strawberries around the border because strawberries was one of the star crops on the farm that she had on Salt Spring. And they were even served at the Empress Hotel. I also thought that it was important that each of the portraits really looked like the women, so I looked for historical photos of each of them. Some of them were really easy to find in the archives, like Emily Carr or Jeannie Butchart, whereas others were more of a challenge, like Emily Tremblay and Sophie Morgeau and Isabel Mainville Ross. And to add an extra challenge, some of them were blurry or small or damaged just due to the age of the photographs. So I had to let my brain sort of fill in some of the information to try and create a portrait. And one that was a particular challenge was Evelyn Penrose. She was wearing a very large hat in her photo, and the shadow covers a lot of her face, so you can't really see most of it. So her face was a lot of educated guessing. The women who were photographers themselves offered a lot more information via their own work. So like Elizabeth Kwok's sister, Hannah Maynard, and Lillian Bland. Lillian actually brought her camera to Canada when she emigrated, and there's a collection of photographs that she actually took, and you just get to see a bit more of their daily life, so like what kind of flowers they had on the table, what flowers they were growing in the garden, their family pets, just daily lifestyle, daily life things and like picnics and stuff, so you get a bit more of a sense of their day-to-day life rather than a formal portrait. Well, most of the reference images that I used were found in archives. There were a few that were supplied by the families and descendants of the women in the book. Everyone, the families and the archive staff, were so helpful and knowledgeable and helped me find images that I never would have been able to find on my own. Before we jump into drawing, I wanted to take a quick moment to show you my digital drawing tools. There are a lot of misconceptions about digital drawing, that somehow it's easier than traditional, or that somehow it draws for you, but neither of those are true. When I first started using digital drawing, I found it really difficult, even more challenging than traditional drawing, and it was a very big learning curve to figure out how to use it. But now that I am comfortable with it, it's really nice to have it as a tool in my toolbox. There are a lot of different versions of digital drawing, but I work with an iPad, an Apple Pencil, and a drawing program called Procreate, which is basically a digital sketchbook. Procreate allows me to use many different styles of brushes, which allows me to experiment with line quality and texture, and one of my favorite features of drawing digitally is being able to use any color that I would like. Let's switch to a better view so you can see the drawing come together. Through the demonstration, I'm going to speed up and slow down the drawing process, as these portraits can take up to 8 hours or more from start to finish. As I talked about earlier, each of the illustrations start with research and finding a photo of the person as a reference. Sometimes the image is chosen because of something in the photo that caught my eye, and other times it was the only one available. For the drawing today, I'm using one of my favorite photos of Emily Carr as a reference from the BC archives. For the book, I used a different reference picture, but today, for you, I wanted to create an original illustration. All of my illustrations begin with a thumbnail, a small rough sketch to work out my ideas and just start brainstorming, so I'm going to start with that today. I might do a number of these to work out my thoughts and ideas for any given project, because it's much easier to change something at this stage when it's small and sketchy than it is to change a full-scale drawing. Once I have a few thumbnails, or once I have one that I like, I move on to a larger scale drawing. I tend to work with a lot of rough, sketchy lines and refine them as I go. Emily Carr was the first illustration I did for the book, and I had an idea right away of how I wanted to draw her. So I'm going to do something similar to that today for the frame, but with a different portrait inside. Like many people who grew up on the island, I was familiar with Emily Carr and her paintings from a very young age. But it wasn't until I began learning more about her through reading her books that I learned about her love for animals. When I saw Emily Carr on the list of women to be included in Her Courage Rises, I knew I wanted to include some of her pets in the portrait, even more than I wanted to focus on her art. I restrained myself to only include 3 of her pets, a white rat, a cat, and of course her monkey Woo. But I could have also included chipmunks, parrots, raccoons, and dogs. I usually add my own elements to the illustration to convey character, but I also love when photos reveal small details about the person. Like in this photo, it looks like in the ruffles of her top, Emily has tucked a small carnation. I love little details like that, so I made sure to include it in the illustration here. Once I'm satisfied with the rough sketch, then I start to tighten up the image and pick the lines that I think are best. These will be the framework for the final painting, so I like to make them as clear as possible. At this stage, to make sure I'm capturing the subject likeness, I refer to the reference image a lot. Now for the painting. This is where the color, depth, and shadow come into play. Almost all of the photographs were in black and white, with the exception of Ruth Masters and Angela Sidney, who had full color photographs. So I had to infer or imagine what color her clothing, hair, eyes, and complexion might have been. For Hazel Anna Wilson, I had the opportunity to talk to her daughter, and she kindly let me know the proper color for Hazel Anna Wilson's regalia and the necklace that she wore, which is something that would have been impossible for me to know without her help. For clothing, I try to fall back on my interest in textile history for information about what colors and cloths were popular at the time of the photo. It's certainly not foolproof, but it gives me some place to start. And sometimes I simply go on what looks cohesive and complements the other design choices that I've made in the image. But even then, I do try to make sure that it feels of its era. I associate deep greens and rich blues with Emily Carr, so that's what we're going to use for the painting. When painting portraits of artists, I like to incorporate some of the colors that they used if I can. And here's a finished illustration. And I would continue that process over 49 other portraits. Thank you so much for watching and listening to me explain my process. I hope you found it as interesting and enjoyable as I find to draw. Thanks again to Megan Purcell and the Friends of BC Archives for inviting Healey and I to do this presentation, and to the BC Archives for allowing me to use that photo of Emily Carr today. If you're interested in my work, please feel free to follow me on social media. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok. You can find all of my current projects and painting experiments there. I do also have a website, Kimiko Fraser at wordpress.com, which I will put on screen. And if you have any questions about my work or this presentation or the illustrations in Her Carved Rises, please feel free to reach out to me on social media or via the contact page on my website. I'll try my best to answer any of your questions. If you're interested in purchasing your own copy of Her Carved Rises, check out either your local independent bookstore or the Heritage House Publishing website for all of your purchasing options. And keep an eye out for the next two books that Healey and I are collaborating on: Kimiko Murakami, a Japanese-Canadian pioneer, and Lillian Bland, an amazing aviatrix. Both of those books should be coming out in May of this year. Thank you and have a wonderful day. Bye.
So that was Kimiko's video and her very interesting drawing process. And now we will ask Healey to come on and share her slides and hear about the writing process.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm going to share my screen and I'll get right into the traditional territory acknowledgement. Hey, thanks so much for having me. Thank you, Megan, for inviting me, and thank you everyone for being here. my name's Healey, and I'd like to acknowledge that I am right now on the traditional unceded territory of this Nanaimo First Nation. And I'm very grateful to live, learn, work, and write on their traditional lands. And that's Nanaimo. So yeah, just a little bit of the shape of the day here. I'll tell you a really little bit about me and how I sort of got into writing about trailblazing women. And then I'm going to go through, and I'll share really briefly the books, but Kimiko did a beautiful job of doing that, so I'll skip through those slides quite quickly. And then I'm going to go through some of the archives that I used to research Her Courage Rises, 50 Trailblazing Women of British Columbia and the Yukon. So I'm not going to take long at each one, but I am going to introduce a woman from each of the archives because to me, archives are very much about the stories. They're about the stories of people and stories of places. So I am a high school counselor in Nanaimo. I'm originally from Muskoka, Ontario, which is the photo on the left, the Canadian Shield, white pines. And I moved to BC in 2009. I did my teaching degree out here, and I just have such an interest and passion for wild places and interesting people. The photo on the right is Cape Scott Provincial Park on the very northern tip of Vancouver Island. So these are the other books, and I think I found it important to show them because some of the stories in Her Courage Rises are actually excerpts out of parts of On Their Own Terms and Flourishing and Free. So a lot of the research that I did, well, some of the research I did for Her Courage Rises was actually done when I was researching On Their Own Terms and Flourishing and Free. So the research, some of it was done 2019 and really early 2020. Coming May of this year, also collaborating with Kimiko, Fraser, and put out by Heritage House, 2 kids books, Kimiko Murakami, a Japanese Canadian pioneer, and Lillian Bland, an amazing aviatrix. So really excited about these 2. And making sort of introducing them to a bit of a younger audience. So for the research, I'll talk about today is about the archives, but I did want to mention that I did also use newspapers, family members, and books. And the photo on the right is from a family member, and that's Cappy Blanchett. I also use newspapers, so I just really briefly wanted to mention that the UBC Open Collections and also Vancouver Island Regional Library has a lot of newspapers available that can be searched by keyword, and then you can find any of that keyword that has shown up. It's highlighted in yellow. Really, really useful. So the first stop along the way on our little archives tour today is the Royal BC Museum and Archives, and I sort of started on the south of the island for today, and we'll go north, so we'll just go visit the archives sort of from south to north today. So starting at the Royal BC Museum and Archives, you know, super important for research for many of the stories in Her Courage Rises. I wanted to first start by talking about the genealogy. And from the genealogy, there's so much that can be gleaned about what I was researching. So obviously the births, the death, baptisms, marriages, and so much more even in those certificates you can find out. So for example, a marriage certificate, for example, a marriage certificate of Emma Stark, I was able to find out her profession, her husband's profession, and you can find out where someone was born, where they were married, just a lot of information if you look closely at it. Photographs were really important. I also found a lot of information for my writing from the photographs, and also just photographs kind of drew me to some of the women that were featured in Her Courage Rises. So for example, this is Hannah Maynard, and Hannah Maynard is on the cover of On Their Own Terms, and yeah, she's of course featured in Her Courage Rises. Hannah Maynard was a photographer. She was doing really progressive photography for her day, and she taught herself photography. So she taught herself photography while she was living in Ontario, and then she opened up a photographic studio above her husband's shoe shop in Victoria, and he eventually joined her in the photography business. And then but he did a lot more of the traveling, and she did a lot more of the photography in the city. And then Hannah Maynard was also Victoria's first police photographer. So a lot of her photographs are on the BC archives. I learned just a lot about the photographic techniques that she used from the photographs. And some of her husband's photographs are also in the archives. And interestingly, a lot of photos of the other women who I have researched for Her Courage Rises, Hannah was the one who took their photos as well. So she was one behind the lens. I found that pretty interesting. Of course, using the microfilm at the BC archives, so much useful information there. And then going through boxes of textual records and finding what I can about the women I was researching. I use a notebook. I put the source at the top and then make my own notes. And then from there, when I sit down to write, I take all of the information that I have found out and put it together into a story. So, but I like to gather all of the information before I start writing. I find it easier to put it together into an interesting story. And then if there's any conflicting information, I can check that and find out what the actual correct information is and go from there. I wanted to mention the Vancouver Maritime Museum and their archives. So there's a lot of, I was able to get a lot of information from there. I won't take too long on here because there wasn't a lot. Oh, there was some from a few women in Her Courage Rises, but Marianne Croft is in Flourishing and Free, and she was a lightkeeper. And Emmy May Binns worked on a boat with her husband, and she was her husband was a captain of a running boat. So she's an interesting one. I'm doing working on a project about her right now. But lots of it. There was also some information about Minnie Patterson, who is in Her Courage Rises at the Vancouver Maritime Museum. So the City of Victoria archives, there were many women who I was able to find information about there. So Emily Carr, Isabella Mainville Ross, Hannah Maynard, Jenny Butchart, Amelia Douglas. And so I wanted to really just briefly mention a little bit about Jenny Butchart here. And Jenny Butchart was from Ontario. She was born in Toronto, raised in Owen Sound, and she attended the Brantford Sound Ladies College. She married a man named Robert Butchart. They had 2 daughters together, and then they moved out to Victoria and then to the Saanich Peninsula. They owned a cement business, and Robert owned a cement plant. Jenny worked as a chemist there, and eventually, once the quarry was empty, all of the limestone had been taken out of it. It was just an empty pit in essentially her backyard. She looked out to it, and she said to Robert one day, "Robert, let's plant it with flowers and let's make it beautiful." So she hired Isabura Kishida, a landscape architect from Victoria, and they got together and they got to planting it. So tourists came from all over. It stayed open through World War II, and to this day is one of the most popular tourist attractions in BC, and perhaps one of the most even in the country. This is Agnes Deans Cameron over here on the right. I also use the City of Victoria archives for information about her, and she appears in On Their Own Terms. The City of Vancouver archives I used to research Mary Ellen Smith and Julia Henshaw. So Mary Ellen Smith was a politician who later moved to Nanaimo. And Julia Henshaw was a botanist and a writer who was born in England and then moved to BC. She did a lot of exploration of the Canadian Rockies, and she wrote guidebooks about wildflowers. So there was information about her and also the photograph. She was an editor for the Vancouver Daily News, and and her story is a really interesting one, and her courage rises. I also wanted to mention the United Church of Canada archives. Although it is in Toronto, I was able to get some information about Victoria Chung, who was a medical missionary from Victoria. And so, I was able to get this photograph from the United Church of Canada archives and some information about her. Her story is amazing. She was a medical missionary. She was born in Victoria. She went to high school in Victoria, and then she ended up going to the University of Toronto. She was the first female intern at the Toronto General Hospital. This was in 1922. And she then went overseas. She went to China to work as a Canadian medical missionary. So this was always her dream, to become a doctor. She was the first Chinese Canadian doctor and the first female Chinese Canadian doctor. So it was 1923 when she went overseas to work in the Marion Barclay Hospital. She was a surgeon, hospital administrator. She taught nursing. She managed the whole hospital by over her time there. And she also did a lot of work in really remote areas. Her story is amazing. And she was, quite amazing. The Salt Spring Island Archives has an amazing photograph collection and a lot of information. I was able to find information about Emma Stark and Kimiko Murakami from the Salt Spring Island Archives. So this is the cover, of course, that's coming out in May. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Emma Stark. The Nanaimo Community Archives I also used for her, so her name will come up there. Emma Stark was the first Black school teacher on Vancouver Island. She was a pioneer teacher. Her parents moved to Salt Spring Island in 1860. They had left the United States and moved up when Governor Douglas invited 800 African Americans in 1858. So her family moved to Salt Spring, and then eventually a few years later they moved to Nanaimo. Emma became a teacher when she was 18, and this was in 1874. She lived in a cabin by the school, and the school was out by Cedar, which is a small community just near Nanaimo. And she went, it was 13 kilometers each way, so she lived at school during the week. Emma's father was tragically killed. He was on his way home and found. The murder was never solved, but it's a little bit of a still a mystery to this day. There was some people said that he refused to sell his land to a really prominent coal mining family, but again, nobody was ever charged. There's an amazing stone monument for Emma Stark and her family in the Chase River Elementary School field, which is right near where they had lived in Nanaimo. The Nanaimo Community Archives, this is my hometown archives in Nanaimo. They have a lot of great information. Emma Stark, Mary Ellen Smith, who moved to Nanaimo, and Edith Berkeley, who is also in Her Courage Rises, who was a marine biologist. She came to Nanaimo to study marine worms. She wasn't able to be paid staff at the biological station in Departure Bay in Nanaimo, but she did her own research anyway, and a lot of times being a volunteer actually afforded her more freedom than being on the staff. So she did a lot of work there. So Edith, Edith Berkeley, her photographs are really amazing. Kimiko did some really beautiful marine worms sort of on the sides of the photograph. So we're moving kind of up the island here and to the Alberni Valley Museum, so in Port Alberni. I was able to get a lot of information about Minnie Patterson from there. And Minnie Patterson is titled in the book as a shipwreck heroine. So Minnie Patterson was born in Ontario, moved to Port Alberni, where her dad actually built a lot of the town. She got married, and the man that she married was a lightkeeper at the Cape Beale Lighthouse. So they moved out to the Cape Beale Lighthouse, and one night they noticed a shipwreck far, far out at sea, and it was a huge storm. The telegraph line was down, and Minnie Patterson took a hike through the forest, through the rainforest, to get to a ship that would be able to save the sailors. That was the only way she could save these sailors who were shipwrecked out at sea, is by going to getting to the telegraph operator's cabin and getting out that way, and getting word to the ship that would save the sailors. So she did a night hike in the storm, in the dark, with gale force winds. She made it just in time. The ship was able to get out and rescue those sailors. So her story is amazing. A lot of information about her at the museum, at the Alberni Valley Museum. So we're moving to the Courtenay and District Museum, and Ruth Masters. So I had a really amazing time at the Courtenay and District Museum. Their folders, they have a lot of information about Ruth Masters. Ruth Masters was a mountaineer, an environmental activist, and she did a lot to protect the wilderness and wildlife around her hometown of Courtenay. So I had one of my highlights in my visit to this archives was very carefully turning the pages in her leather-bound notebooks that they have. Ruth, among all of what she did leather work, and she made 3 very thick, very beautiful leather-bound notebooks. One is about the history of the Comox Valley. One is about the history of Forbidden Plateau, and one is about Comox Valley war veterans. So just so much information presented so beautifully in these huge leather-bound notebooks that are at the museum. One of my favorite things that I was able to find in their file about Ruth Masters was a newspaper article of Ruth as a 90-year-old woman being taken into a police car after trying to save a black bear and getting that she thought was in danger from conservation officers that had made its way into the city. So yeah, Ruth Masters was part of the Clayoquot Sound logging blockades. She protested mining and damming in Strathcona Park, and she donated her land to be the Ruth Masters Greenway, turned into a land trust so that it can be developed. And she's the one in the center of this photo. And then we've moved up north to the north part of the island, the museum at Campbell River, and the Archives Research Center. So I stumbled upon Elizabeth Kwok's sister at the museum at Campbell River, and she has a collection of photographs, which is what I originally stumbled upon. There are a few photos of her, but mostly it's photos that she took herself. They are amazing, absolutely beautiful photographs of everything from everyday life to working at canneries, to her community, beautiful totem poles. She just had such an eye for capturing moments and capturing really, really beautiful, beautiful moments and beautiful things. I also found a lot of research about Anne Elmore Haig Brown and at the museum at Campbell River. So yeah, a little bit more about Ruth Masters, or about Elizabeth Kwok's sister. She was born in Night Inlet. She worked on fish boats, canneries, and she worked as a nurse's aide. She had 10 children, and her photo collection is from 1940 to 1960. She was fluent in Kwakwale, and she sewed traditional regalia, and a lot of information I was also able to get from her son, George Kwok's sister Jr., who lives in Campbell River. But yeah, it was her collection of photos at the archives that where I first discovered her. And then the last museum is the Port Hardy Museum, and the Port Hardy Museum is where I discovered Lillian Bland, who was a Quetzino Sound pioneer and homesteader, and also built and flew her own plane. I found most of the information for her through actually Ireland, where she is from, but that's where I first discovered her, was at the Port Hardy Museum when they had an exhibit. So yeah, I hope that was a good little tour of the archives that I used, and I'm happy to answer any questions, or I can elaborate on any of the archives if necessary. I can kind of go back if necessary.
Thank you, Healey. Healey, I'm Lara Wilson. I'm on the board of the Friends of the BC Archives. I'm the president, and I'm looking after the Q&A today. So we've had a question. What did a police photographer take pictures of? I guess this is related to Hannah Maynard.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so Hannah Maynard was a police photographer. What that involved is when somebody was taken into custody to get the mug shot, Hannah Maynard took the photo of them, got the photo of them, like the mug shot of them. So the photo of the front of their face, the photo of the side profile. And Hannah was so skilled at photography that she actually found a way to get both the front and the side profile on one slide. So very efficient, saved them resources and time. And so, yeah, she wasn't, was dead or injured crime victims. It was more the, I guess, like alleged, like the person who had done the crime. So yeah, it ranged from petty crime, like somebody who had stolen something, all the way up to, there were some, I mean, she didn't see them when they had blood on their hands, but I did read and find some information that she took photos of a woman who had tried to murder her husband with a razor. So the photo's really interesting. The woman has a very kind of blank look on her face. So yeah, somewhat gory. And Hannah's amazing. Yeah, she's really amazing. There's a lot about her. The story's a lot longer on their own terms. And just her photography even is just incredible. Like, this is, I think, such a striking photo, and there are so many. There's one where there are 5. Hannah's made 5 of herself. And yeah, she's just, she was really interesting. Why did she do the photographing instead of her husband? She started it kind of just as a hobby. In all the free time she had, well, in Ontario, just with free time, she taught herself, and then she, it just turned it into a business when they moved out west, because it was moving from paintings being what, documented people's faces, I guess, to people wanted the new technology of the time. Victoria was a gold rush town, it was booming, and people wanted the trendy, they wanted they wanted photographs. It was the new technology of the time. He owned a shoe shop. He was a leather worker by trade. So that's why she did the photographing instead, because he had his shoe business below her studio. He only joined her when I think business got so busy. Hopefully that helps. Answers that question.
Thanks, Healey. Next question. Healey, how do you select which women you're going to research and include in your books?
Oh yeah, that's a really good question. So I think they were women who, I am drawn to women who were doing different things for the time period. So they were doing kind of unusual or really kind of amazing things for the time period. I first was inspired to write about Trailblazing Women when I got a tour of Cougar Annie's garden. And if anyone's heard of that garden, it's near Tofino, a boat ride from Tofino. And Cougar Annie was just amazing. And so that's where I first started. So doing interesting things. Also, then there would have to be enough information about them. I had to be able to find enough information to put a story together. And yeah, so those were kind of the main things.
Healey, another question. Were many Indigenous women included in the archives, or did you have to rely on other sources for that research?
Yeah, that's a really good question as well. Most of the so the Indigenous women, so Elizabeth Kwok's sister was a lot of information about her, like her whole photograph collection, of course, was at the Campbell River Archives, but most of the information I did get from George Kwok's sister Jr. about her. And then there were, I'm just thinking of a few of the other women. So Kate Carmack, there was some information about her at archives. So she was, of course, present during the discovery of gold that spurred the Klondike Gold Rush. So lots about her. And then some of the other women, I always tried to talk to the family members. Angela Sidney, it was more tended to be books, I think, like Angela Sidney, it was more books, some videos through the National Film Board of Canada and that sort of thing. But try to talk to the family member as much as possible and get really the details and make sure that I'm portraying them in a way that their family members want them to be portrayed as well. And yeah.
Thanks, Healey. Another question. Did you include any teachers in your book?
Teachers, that's a really good question. So Agnes Deans Cameron was in On Their Own Terms. As far as Her Courage Rises, like Elizabeth Kwok's sister was a teacher, like a cultural teacher. So I would consider her a teacher. I would also consider, there were a few other women who were kind of informal teachers. I think Nellie Cashman worked as a teacher before. Sorry, I'm just going through. Most of them were kind of more informal teachers. They were like language teachers or cultural teachers.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
Another question. The illustrations are such a great way to bring these women to life. So it's this person also notes that it's sometimes prohibitively expensive to publish archival photos. At what point and why did you decide to take the creative approach of the paintings?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. So I think the age group that the book is aimed at. So Her Courage Rises is for 12 and up. So it would be found in a young adult section. I think that it's very, very, interesting and accessible to anyone, to adults. So I think the age making, history more accessible to a younger age group. And it was one of Heritage House's amazing editor, Laura Cordick's idea to do the to do illustrations and make the stories slightly shorter. So that was, yeah, the idea of Laura. And I just think it makes it very accessible for younger historians,
Great.
younger age group.
Yeah, very effective. A few more questions. You've both mentioned today the upcoming books, but somebody asks, are there archives you didn't visit? Are there future plans for the extension of this project?
Oh, yes, there were archives I didn't visit. The ones in the Yukon. I love the Yukon so much. I have lived there before, but I didn't get up there to do the research. So I was able to get information online, and a lot of archives have a lot of really great information online now, which is fabulous. So that was really great. So yeah, the ones in the archives, and then also there were a few other ones. I didn't get to the Salt Spring Island archives. They have a lot online though. And there were a few other ones, some of the ones in the interior as well. Sonia Cornwall was a rancher. And I wasn't able to get to her archives like in the interior. That was just too far to go. Plans for the extension of this project. Yeah, so the Trailblazing Canadians series is kids books. And of course, starting with the Kimiko Murakami and Lillian Bland. And anyone interested can look out for future ones the following spring. And then, yeah, for a similar one to Her Courage Rises, yeah, people can look out on the Heritage House website. And yeah, definitely there will be more extensions for future projects, and taking into consideration other places in Canada.
That's congratulations, and that's really exciting. Another question, when doing your research, what was the most difficult type of information to uncover? Any special tips?
Oh, difficult information. For sure. I think it was like personal information was hard to uncover. And I think just kind of the personality of people, if you're trying to figure out like who someone was. Yeah, I think, yeah, just personal information, sort of about maybe like, their children or their personal life was a little bit harder to find, or their their relationship with their partner, that kind of thing. It was really hard to get a sense of that. I don't know if it was that, back then it was easy to find like how many kids they had and that sort of stuff, but it was harder to find, or sorry, yeah, it was, but yeah, and it was easier to find stuff about their job and their accomplishments, but less about their personal lives, I would say. Special tips. I just think there's so much to be gleaned from photographs. I just think, there's so much to be found in photographs, and really looking at photographs and the caption of photos. I found so much about dates and timeline of things, and even just, kind of emotion and how they felt about something, body language, that sort of stuff. I found that sort of interesting. And then also just the genealogical search from the BC archives. There's just so much in there. If you can decipher the handwriting on the different certificates, because it's all handwritten, of course. But yeah, I just think looking at those really closely, you can find a lot.
Yes, lots
and
of
someone said a
information
picture
and
really
content.
is worth it.
Yep.
Yes, and someone just said a picture really is worth 1,000 words, and I held back from saying that just now, so it's true though.